So hello and welcome to part 6 of the AS and A-Level Java series, and this is the episode we are going to, in this episode we are going to look at typecasting. So maybe let me just zoom in a little bit so that you guys can see better. Okay, so typecasting essentially is basically converting between two data types, right? That's typecasting. So oftentimes you might realize that you might have declared something as an int, right? Then later on in the program you might want to assign it to a double, right? So that process whereby you're trying to convert from an int to a double, that's the process called typecasting, is it? So you're basically trying to convert a type from one form into another form. And so typecasting comes in two flavors. There is something called implicit typecasting, and then there's also explicit typecasting. So let me just maybe first comment it out like so, then we'll move on to explore the various forms or the various ways you can go about typecasting. And also before we do that, maybe we need to declare variables. Let me just say variable declaration. So maybe let's declare an int called sum and assign it a value of maybe 1, 2, 3, 4. And then in order to get rid of this error that you see, that's quick, it's not really an error, right? It's just maybe a warning, if I should say, that I've been given by the IDE that this particular value is not being used anyway. So in order for me to get rid of that, let me just come here and say system.out.println. Then I can just print out sum here so that that error goes away. Alright, so now in order for me to demonstrate the concept of implicit typecasting, remember implicit typecasting, maybe you can think of it as, say, promotion, if I should say. We are basically promoting a type from a lesser rank to a higher rank. You can think of it that way. So remember, data types in Java, the way they are built is that you have data types that are of type integer, like byte, right? Like byte. It's a value that you can actually declare. Maybe let me just call it small, and I'll put a value of 5 in there. So byte is an integer data type that uses a very small memory location. Is it? So, but remember, in the previous tutorial, I told you that you don't need really to worry about these other data types. Is it? You just focus on int for the most part. And maybe what I might just do in this tutorial to show you that you can do implicit type promotion or typecasting is to make use of the double data type. So maybe let's just call this one total, right? So maybe suppose we wanted the sum of total to be equal to to be the same as the value of sum. So notice in this case that I'm taking what's on the left and I'm storing it on what. Sorry, I'm taking what was on the right and storing it on what's on the left. Is it? So basically, this means that the value of sum, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going to be stored inside of a memory location called total, but this time around it's going to be treated as a double. So this is an example of implicit typecasting. So implicit typecasting, basically it's some form of type promotion, right? So you can also promote, maybe say a float price, let's say it's 12.52. Then we can then come here and declare a double called variable names should be meaningful, but I can't really think of any words that I can use. Maybe let me just go with X, and let me just call that price, that variable. I'm calling it price. So remember what I said earlier about whenever you declare a float, you always need to append an F so that you don't get a compilation error. And of course, remember, these yellow squiggly lines that I'm getting, they are not really errors, but they are just it's just the IDE telling me that I'm not using that particular variable anyway in the program. So maybe what I can do is just come here and output those two values so that I can get rid of those squiggly lines, because they make it seem like we have an error. Okay, so this is implicit typecasting. So basically we are promoting a lesser data type up one level, is it? So int and float, they are, when we are talking of hierarchy, they rank lesser than a double, is it? So this is basically implicit typecasting. Then you can also implicitly typecast, maybe say okay, maybe let's just write some as before. So maybe you might be wondering that since we have two values or rather two data types for floating point numbers, that is float and double, why is it that for int we only have or we are using just int? Remember, I said that there are other types like byte, like short, and like long that you can use as integer types, is it? So maybe you can have an integer called y, but it's of type long, is it? This is a very long number. It's on the scale of billions. Sorry about that. It's on the scale of billions. And so we can promote our sum value to a long called sum, and maybe we can just go ahead and print it down in the console, and that should work just fine, because basically an int ranks lower than a long. So that's not going to have any problem at all. So now let's move on to look at the alternate form of typecasting, which is called explicit typecasting. This one you can think of it as demotion, if I should say. So it's the opposite of promotion, right? So remember, earlier on we had declared, maybe say a float called price, and what can I do here? Maybe let me just declare new variables so that we can make use of under here. So maybe let's say the double called radius. Maybe say we are talking about the radius of a circle, and it's 85.3, right? Then we can just come here and say radius. But before we print the radius, we might realize that since we declared it as a double, right? Maybe we are using a lot of memory for this particular program, or this particular program is it's consuming a lot of resources, as it were. Maybe processing power, or maybe it might be memory. So maybe you want to demote this value from double so that it uses less memory to a float. So the way you can go about it is to say float, then we have the variable, which is, let's call it a new value, let's just call it rad, and say equal so here we say float, right? So notice that I'm using parentheses, then the keyword float inside of the parentheses. Then now I have to type the identifier of the value that I want to typecast or to promote downwards into a float. So this is the way of doing explicit, or rather of going about explicit typecasting. So this is the format for demoting a value from a double to a float, but it's also the format that you can apply to other concepts as well. Like maybe say if you wanted to convert from you can actually demote from a double to an int, but that is only if the number is it doesn't contain. Actually, it might actually work. It might just be rounded down. Let's actually see that in action. Maybe let's just call this circumference for some reason, because that's the name that came to mind since we're talking about circles. So circumference is equal to int. Then we want to try and convert that rad variable. That, yeah, it actually works, is it? So notice that we had demoted this radius into a float. Then we can actually demote or convert this float into a rad, is it? But this time around, I want you to notice what happens. Since a float and a radius, sorry, a float and an integer, a float is going to have decimal points, whereas an integer doesn't have decimal points. It now means that that value is going to be rounded to the nearest whole number. That's basically what's going to happen there. So let's actually run the code and see what happens. So you see that instead of printing 85.3, this time around it just printed 85. So basically it's going to get rid of this decimal part, basically round it off to the nearest whole number. That's what's going to happen. Then maybe as a side note, I should also mention that maybe there are some things that you can't attempt with typecasting. Like for instance, you can't typecast a character into a string. The reason being that a character is a primitive, whereas a string is actually a reference type. Is it by reference type we simply mean that it is a class that is built within the Java language. So in other words, a string is an array of characters. So if you wanted to explicitly typecast a character into a string, you would need to have a character array, is it? But I think maybe for now it's a concept we can set aside and we can explore it later on in the tutorial, in the course rather. When we start looking at when we have looked at arrays, then maybe we can then come back and explore that concept of trying to typecast between a string, or rather between characters and strings. But just know for that for now you can't really do that because they are incompatible types. If you were to attempt to do something like that, you'll get the incompatible type error. Alright, so I think that's just about it for this tutorial. I'll see you in the next one.